Peter Boghossian, an American philosopher, an activist, a pro-atheism activist, very much his thrust in academia promoting critical thinking. He wrote a book, it was published in 2013, called A Manual for Creating Atheists, which I suppose might have created a bit of a stir. We're speaking to him from Melbourne. Hello, Peter Boghossian. How are you?
I am fantastic. It's great to be on, and you're absolutely correct that if people are honest with themselves and have basic tools of critical thinking, they will come to certain conclusions about the nature of reality in the universe.
But so many people don't, and a lot of them maintain, I am rational in my faith, I am rational in my belief. Atheists have to have as much faith as anybody else. How does that work?
Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to define what they mean by faith.
Yeah.
And I think that, so here's something I've been thinking about, if I may. So I have had 9 or 10 talks, or I actually don't even know how many talks and debates I've had. And so I've realized that no matter what I say, Christians in particular will say, well, that's not what we mean by faith, no matter what definition I give. So I started doing something. I started putting in quotations from famous Christian apologists. And apologist comes from 1 Peter 3:15. It's basically a defender of the faith. And when I was in Sydney, somebody said to me, those are taken out of context. And I was amazed by that. I spent the last year working with students looking at the word faith and how Christians use the word faith. So I said, well, what can I do? And hopefully this is answering your question. I'm sorry it's a long answer, but it's a really good question. So then what I did was I put in a video of the world's leading Christian apologist, and I played about 5 minutes of it. And then a Christian at the end of one of my talks said, you didn't play the whole video. The rest of the video shows that was taken out of context. So the next talk I gave, I played the whole video. And a Christian came up to me and said, he doesn't speak for all Christians. In other words, Christians will do anything that they can, not only Christians, but religious folks in general, people of faith in general, will do anything they can to attempt to reconcile the fact that faith is belief in the absence of evidence, or it's belief that's not warranted by the evidence. So the first order of business is to pin them down on what they mean by the word faith.
And what they mean often by the word God, because two people can think of completely different things if using the one word.
Yeah, that's right. And I really want to stress that this is not a semantic game. This is not just like some trick of language. And I don't want to be pedantic about it, but it's really important to define what you mean when you say these things. For example, Christians say, well, you have faith in your wife. That's not the same. My wife is an actual person, a real person.
So I've heard this argument, you have faith, that, just as you said, the faith that you love your wife, your girlfriend, whatever. Actually, no, I don't. It's based on evidence. They do stuff.
Okay, so we got two things operative there. The first thing is, faith in my wife to do what? Here's how you could say that is a correct usage. My wife has never flown a plane before. She's not a pilot. I don't even think she's been in a cockpit. She has no flying experience whatsoever. But let's say we found ourselves on a plane. The pilot died of a heart attack. My wife's a physician, so she went in to try to save him or something, and she finds herself alone in the cockpit. You could then say, I have faith that my wife could fly this plane. That would be a reasonable use of the word faith. Contrast that with I have faith my wife loves me. Now, there are two things going on with I have faith my wife loves me. First, I have evidence she acts in such a way that she does love me. So I don't need any faith. But the other more profound issue is that you can touch her. You can see her. She's a real person. Now, contrast that to the supernatural realm. Spirits, pixies, whatever entities allegedly populate this realm. Mistaking the category of an actual physical person with make-believe land. It's a question of what's true and how you use language to reflect that truth. There's a kind of cognitive dissonance. Like, there are certain things they just don't want to admit to themselves, or they have difficulty reconciling.
They can keep a bloody good straight face while saying so, though. And I tend to think, well, gosh, they really do believe they're being rational.
Right. Well, that's the question. Are they sincere?
I reckon plenty aren't, but what about the sincere ones?
It's interesting. It's like, that's why when you ask somebody, and I've been asking this on this tour a lot lately, do you believe there was ever a talking snake? That's one question for Christians. Another one for Muslims is, do you believe women should be stoned for adultery? And I cannot possibly tell you. In fact, every time I've asked somebody that question, instead of saying yes, no, or I don't know, they've gone off in some tangent, they've obfuscated, and then I've asked them again. In one sense, the type of people with whom we can converse are the people who say, yes, I actually do believe there's a talking snake. Okay, so that's good. That's actually really good.
Yeah.
Because you know they're sincere. Now you can have a conversation about how they know there's a talking snake. But if somebody is not willing to give an answer, a direct answer to the question, then it's very difficult to have that conversation. In fact, it's impossible. I used to use the question, if Mormons believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet and Muslims believe that Muhammad was a prophet and Muhammad was the last prophet, well then Joseph Smith lived, this is just a factual statement about the world. Joseph Smith lived after Muhammad. So somebody has got to be wrong. There are a few responses that you'll get for that, for the most part. You get some curveballs, but the more fundamentalist Muslims will say, you know, that's right, that's correct, someone's wrong, and they're wrong. However, the more sophisticated, to borrow a term from Jerry Coyne, the more sophisticated responses to that will be to obfuscate in some way and not give direct answer to the question, to say, well, it depends what you mean by prophet. So here's what I've switched to, and I offer this to you and your audience to think about. There are very explicit references in the Quran that Jesus was not crucified. There is a very specific reference. In fact, it actually says, and I invite your listeners to Google this, Jesus was not crucified. Well, that's the linchpin belief of Christians, that Jesus died, was crucified, died, and rose from the dead. Now, was Jesus crucified, yes or no? I cannot fathom that you would have a Muslim who would say something different, in the same way that I cannot fathom that there would be a Christian who would say something different. Just to interrupt myself for one quick parenthetical, admittedly, you do have Christians like liberation theologians who say that even if there was no historical Jesus, they would still have faith. I cannot possibly fathom why that's the case, but I would argue that they're on the fringe. So then how do you reconcile the fact that Jesus was either crucified or not crucified? In the ideal world, you'd let a Muslim talk about that with a Christian, except they cannot do one thing. They cannot invoke faith. So now adjudicate that. Since the whole thing is ridiculous and you're a rational person, there's no point to you adjudicating it. What you'd do is you'd find a Muslim and a Christian and you'd ask them to adjudicate it.
Yeah.
It's pretty specific. The Bible is very specific about Christ being crucified, and the Quran is incredibly specific about Christ not being crucified. So it's not just a case that half the people are wrong. There's a difference between misconstruing reality and being delusional. And I've argued in one of my talks, Jesus, the Easter Bunny, and other delusions, just say no. It's not that people have misconstrued reality. It's that they're suffering from a delusion.
A lot of Christians support that they have a rational faith in Christ or a rational belief in Christ because there is, to them, an overwhelming amount of evidence that he existed, he died, he said he was God, he was resurrected, hundreds of people saw it, there are many eyewitnesses, and there you go.
Okay, now we need to take a step back. Here's what you don't want to do. You don't want to ever engage the evidence with somebody, because if you do engage the evidence with someone, remember, they don't formulate their beliefs on the basis of evidence in the first place, because if they did, they wouldn't hold those beliefs. Is there sufficient evidence that every rational person would assent to it? Well, no, obviously not, because the majority of people don't believe those things. So let's talk for a second about what it means to believe things on the basis of evidence. You said that there's overwhelming evidence that Jesus was an actual historical person, and there's a whole field of study on that, the historicity of Jesus. Jesus did all these things that the Bible claimed that he did. Okay. So when you say that you formulate your beliefs on the basis of evidence, by definition, what that means is there could be some other piece of evidence that comes along that would cause you to change your mind. That's what it means to formulate your beliefs on the basis of evidence. So then the question for them is, okay, what would the evidence be to convince you that the stories in the Bible are just that? They're stories, they're not actual accounts. If they say there is no evidence, then the response to that is, well, then you don't formulate your beliefs on the basis of evidence.
In employing critical thinking, you go in to anything being prepared to have your mind changed.
The problem is that when people think that faith is a virtue and they want to stick to their faith, but faith is not a virtue. It's an unreliable way of coming to know truth about the world. And I think a key switch in people's thinking is if they stop thinking about faith as a virtue and start thinking about faith as a way to know the world. So in the Jesus was crucified example, how does one know that? So if you say Jesus was crucified or Jesus was not crucified, those are facts about the world. You're making a knowledge claim. And the moment you make a knowledge claim, you can turn the tools of science and subject it to that. You can look at those knowledge claims. So if someone said Jesus walked on water, and for whatever reason, I found that Christians just cannot stand that example. But Jesus walked on water is a knowledge claim. So if somebody says that, they're making a claim that there was an actual historical figure named Jesus who walked across the water unaided by technology. So how do you know that? Then that's the theme of the tour. How do you know? The other problem is that people think that holding these beliefs makes them humble. I mean, I personally have never understood that because it seems exactly the opposite to me. But holding a belief about reality does not make you humble. It makes that belief correct or incorrect.
Yeah, and your claim that it is correct is the opposite of humble.
Well, yeah, I mean, it has to be, right?
Yeah. An area where critical thinking doesn't get expressed or talked about much, and that's politics. Or maybe it does. Right. No, I've missed a meeting. It is the public perception that if a politician changes their mind about something because they found new evidence, they've flipped-flopped, they are unreliable, they're an idiot, untrustworthy. Everybody points a finger and says, you said this before, and now you're saying that. Well, it might be for a very good reason because there's new evidence and they've learnt something. I think that's a virtue, but in politics, it's suicide.
Yeah, I've written about that exact thing. So changing your mind in the face of incoming evidence is actually a virtue. It's an attitudinal disposition. That's one of the cornerstones of rationality, is that you change your mind based upon new evidence. But people use that for political gain. They say, look, this guy said this in one campaign. Obama was famous for the statements about Guantanamo, closing Guantanamo, troops on the ground. Troops on the ground is a great example of that because that situation is fluid. It's constantly changing. And so if somebody changes their mind based upon new evidence, even if someone changes their mind repeatedly, because the situation on the ground, an example of the theater of war, that changes constantly. I think it's a way to smear people, particularly in politics, but I think it's important to take a step back from that and ask, okay, so why did somebody change their mind? Mm. So a quick addition to that, look, if somebody says to you, look, we need to have this public policy, and you say, well, why do you need to have that public policy? And they said, well, because it's in my ancient book here. It's right in this book right here. It says so in this chapter, in this chapter, in this chapter. So the problem with that is once you make something sacred, the whole concept of sacred, that it's immune to revision because it's given to you by an authority, a supernatural authority, something beyond human rationality and human reason. And the problem with that is you can't revise those beliefs. You can't revise those public policies. And you need to look no further than in the Islamic world for that, and concepts of blasphemy, etc. So we need to take a good, hard look at the reasons for our public policies, and we need to cleanse them of any form of superstitious thinking that's fueling those beliefs, particularly in the realm of anthropogenic global climate change. Mm.
There are apologists of the ilk of Reza Aslan. I don't know, listeners may not know, but he's basically would say you have a profoundly unsophisticated idea of what religion is.
Reza Aslan, Karen Armstrong.
And that, shall we say, the manifesto of people like ISIS and their ilk. It's not about religion. It's about oppression. The Sunnis were treated worse than the Shiites, and if we hadn't gone in and been a colonial bastard on the ground, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing.
So here's the thing. There really are no two sides to world hunger. Because you have somebody who advocates a position, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's any truth in that position. I think those positions are absurd. So you need only look, for example, at honor killings. What do honor killings have to do with U.S. foreign policy? Yeah. Nothing. Now, you can say that they're cultural. You can say they're tribal. We can take a look at those views and examine them. So Reza Aslan is an example of the worst kind of specious. His reasoning for things is specious. So I just want to say a couple things. In order to have this conversation, we need to really look at the evidence. And if the evidence does not comport with one's ideology, then one has to discard one's ideology or way of looking at it. Here's how I think it's important to begin these conversations. Clearly, Islam does not, the Quran in particular, does not have everything to do with people's motivations for acting. I mean, clearly that's not the case. And you see this in the Sharia movement, you see this on the right. If it were the case that everybody had some kind of a strict interpretation of Islam or a strict interpretation of the Quran, there'd be no cultural variation. And Dearborn, Michigan, for example, that has a high Muslim population, would be in ashes. It's not in ashes. It's doing very well. I don't think they've ever had a suicide bombing there. So I think that's one extreme that can be ruled out. I think the other extreme that can be ruled out is that it has absolutely nothing to do with Islam. Al-Baghdadi, for example, ISIS has a PhD in Islamic studies. If you look at Mike Flynn, the former Army intelligence officer, what he was talking about on a great interview on Charlie Rose, a lot of these folks that they capture from ISIS, these are not people who are concerned about the plight of the poor Palestinians. These are people who are very knowledgeable about Islam. This is not Islam for dummies either. So clearly the Islamic State, IS, Islamic State, clearly it has something to do with Islam. In order to have any kind of a productive conversation, we need to rule out those two extremes. Does it have nothing to do with Islam? No, of course not. Does it have everything to do with the Quran? No, obviously, of course it doesn't. Then we can have a meaningful conversation about what is the role of religion and what ought to be the responses to these egregious instances of murder, torture, rape, etc.
It doesn't help, though, the Quran. It doesn't say that martyrdom is a bad thing, put it that way.
There are many things going on. First is that if you read the Quran and you look at people like, you mentioned Reza, I try not to talk about it, but he always cites the passages in the beginning of the Quran. But there's something about the law of abrogation in which the passages at the end of the Quran, towards the end, trump the passages in the beginning. And unfortunately for humanity, those passages in the end tend to be acerbic and more vituperative, more violent. Look, anybody can interpret a book any way they want to interpret a book.
I really wonder about that. Why not just read what it says? I think there's far too much interpretation going on. Oh, it doesn't mean what it says. Well, if it doesn't mean what it says, then it wasn't written by God.
To me and you, that's blatantly obvious that this book did not have a supernatural creator. But I could take a work of Shakespeare and I could interpret that a certain way. In fact, in philosophy, we have a science called hermeneutics, a quote-unquote science. And that was founded by these two guys, Dilthey and Schleiermacher. And the idea is, what is the correct interpretation of a book or passage? Well, look, there is no correct interpretation. Because you bring something to that interpretive context, right? You bring a psychology, a history, a culture, maybe even a tribalism to that. That being said, the problem is that some people want to be fundamentalists in terms of how other people interpret the Quran. Pamela Geller is an example of that. She is, and I talked about her in my TAM, the Amazing Meeting talk called Authenticity. She's an example of somebody who thinks there's only one right way to interpret the Quran. So what happens is she has become a fundamentalist in terms of a religion which isn't even hers. So if somebody doesn't take an interpretation of the Quran that she thinks they should have, then all of a sudden they're wrong. Isn't that the problem with having a book in the first place, is that God's law is subject to multiple interpretations? That's not very convincing to me.
We're speaking with Peter Boghossian, advocate for critical thinking and atheism, the book. So, a manual for creating atheists. 22nd of July, Wednesday. That's at the Owen Glen Theatre at Auckland University, 6 p.m. for a 6:30 start. There'll be a Q&A afterwards. And I hope people of faith go along and have a listen to you as well.
Well, thank you. I would like to particularly encourage people of faith to come up, and I usually give them the mic first at the Q&A, and I do spend most of my time with people with whom I have substantive disagreements about the nature of reality. And so hopefully you're religious or you're a person of faith and you want to come and we can have a good chat during the Q&A.
Peter Boghossian, thanks very much. This from a cracking movie called Best of Enemies, a great rivalry. First, the voice you will hear is Gore Vidal, then William F. Buckley.
The first shows me at the age of 25, looking rather anxious. I've just bought a large house in the country and cannot afford it. Here you see the young author of Willowar at the age of 19, still in uniform. Here, above the bathtub, in the place of honor, are the debates with William Buckley in 1968. He was a well-known right-wing commentator whose name seldom passes my lips.
William F. Buckley.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That was a very nice introduction. On the other hand, if it hadn't been, I would have smashed you in the goddamn face.
That is a little cut from an extraordinary thing that happened in one of the most extraordinary years, maybe in humanity. When you think about it, add up all the things that happened in the year of 1968. We're talking with the director of Best of Enemies. It's a true highlight. I hate saying must see, but I recommend you do. Robert Gordon, director of Best of Enemies. Thanks for being with us for a bit of a chat.
Very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
1968, to put it in perspective, when the series of so-called debates between the right and the left, William F. Buckley Jr. and Gore Vidal, the left and the right. It just struck me because I've often thought what a remarkable year 1968 was, and this is just another thing to add to what happened, this media, almost revolution, a little storm. But 68, what a year.
Totally packed with turmoil. You know, it was so contentious in the U.S. that there were major newspapers giving ink to the possibility of a brand new civil war in the nation. It was as polarized as it could be, it seemed.
When you think about culturally, Vietnam, the reaction to that, there was a musical revolution, and add on to that, you cannot forget, it's the year where Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were struck down, and that's only a few years after JFK, and it's immediately in the wake of that.
Exactly. Those assassinations were 3 months and 1 month prior to these meetings. It felt like it was everything to play for. And when you see Vidal and Buckley going at each other, you can sense their intent to basically to take the other one down. They came to this meeting to attack in defense of the nation. Each kind of saw the other as dangerous and as corrosive to the republic.
Like a menu, it's often difficult to describe what you actually get on the plate, and I think something that might help. You describe the two characters. First, Gore Vidal, because he's known here mainly as an author, not as a media commentator.
Well, Gore Vidal was really on the rise in 1968. He had startled the nation in 1948 when he published The City and the Pillar, which presented gay protagonists unapologetically. Then earlier in 1968, he had published Myra Breckenridge, a novel of the polymorphous perverse, what Gore once described as about a man who becomes a woman who becomes a man. So Gore was professing all kinds of outrageous statements that the right took basically as attacks. You know, he was pro-reform of marijuana laws, you know, gay rights way ahead of its time, things that took 50 more years to come around.
Yeah.
He was trumpeting them then. He and Buckley had some matchups prior to this, although nothing as large as this, which was live and in front of the nation for 10 nights.
And urbane, of course, the big vocabulary. and has a sort of calm confidence. Is there a modern analogue for Gore Vidal?
You know, that's something we've thought about a lot. And it's interesting. I think that the only modern analog to either man was Christopher Hitchens, who passed away about 3 years ago. We interviewed Christopher Hitchens. He was one of the earliest interviews we did for this film in 2010, actually, before he was diagnosed with cancer. I think he brought that kind of not only education, but also wit that both men had.
Yeah. All right. William F. Buckley in the red corner. Describe.
William F. Buckley was a man who made his mark in 1951 with the publication of God and Man at Yale, a book that attacked one of the Ivy League schools here for what he claimed was their attack on religion, fomenting communism among its students. And so Buckley then did something that was really quite extraordinary, which was, at that time, the conservatives were represented by the John Birch Society, what Buckley called the kooks and the anti-Semites. And he cleaned them out. He began to rebrand the political right and led the charge that gave the right something that they could stand behind that wasn't Neanderthal and troglodyte. And Buckley sees the great apogee of his work is in 1980 when Ronald Reagan gets elected. That's Buckley's crowning achievement.
In the movie, he's described as the St. Paul of the conservative movement.
He could have been the playboy of the Western world, but instead he became the St. Paul of the conservative movement. Exactly right.
Yeah, but his beliefs in the movie, because you're really showing the debate, we don't get a detailed idea of what he believes that much. I mean, was he a segregationist, that sort of thing? He's described as a libertarian, or
Right.
Where would he fit?
One of the great things about Buckley was that he shifted. He acknowledged errors. So he had come out as a segregationist in the early 60s. Buckley founded a magazine called National Review, which became the bullhorn of the conservative political thought. And they were segregationists, and then Buckley in the mid-60s realized that it was in error, and he changed and fought for civil rights, which is something I think really to be admired in a spokesperson who can shift without it's not flip-flopping. No. It's actually changing his mind.
Yeah, it's called learning. It's the most admirable thing.
It's called learning, exactly.
Yeah, and Malcolm X did it, to his eternal credit.
Yes. I think it's I think any of these leaders who can point to it and show they're not doing it to win votes. That's a great thing, and brave too.
Yeah.
So Buckley was he was elitist. He believed that educated people should rule, and kind of all the things that happened with Reagan, trickle-down economics. He was a capitalist and kind of a shill for corporate greed behind the guise of saying that this would be good for the nation.
One of the remarkable things that anyone going to see this movie may, just find remarkable, maybe even scratch their heads. These two people speak like they're from another planet, or there's a 51st state where people talk like that. It just doesn't happen much anymore.
Again, freedom breeds inequality. Now I'll say it a third time.
No, twice is enough. He's always to the right and almost always in the wrong.
I confess that anything complicated confuses Mr. Vidal.
But somehow hold to that.
Stop calling me a crypto-Nazi.
Let's stop
calling names you in your goddamn face, and you'll stay plastered.
They are using $10 words like they're at a 1-cent slot machine. It's remarkable, but it's really kind of exhilarating too. I mean, there's nothing that you can't understand, although you may want to go look up a few things, to get the real nuances of their meaning. But I kind of think it's great. It's stimulating. It reminds us that TV has dumbed us down in potentially dangerous ways.
Yeah. One thing that is stunning, you know how some people just have a face that the camera loves? And William F. Buckley, where does he get that smile? He could charm the scales off an alligator. What a face.
It's a beautiful thing. I mean, and I think he worked it too, as did Vidal. They were both handsome men. There's something really amazing here because, in a way, these two men look and sound so very much alike, but their political positions are polar opposites.
With the discussions that happened during the Democratic and Republican conferences in that year, where they were the commentator exercise in the movie, They barely get to discussion issue. The bell rings, and the first thing is an ad hominem attack. Was it really like that, or did you pick those bits out?
I think our ratio is pretty much like the raw material. In the actual debates, it was within like 2 minutes, maybe 2 minutes and 10 seconds that the first punch is thrown, and that they begin to go after each other. But, it's powerful because we feel that these two men, we feel what they represent. And it really is, it's a battle of ideas, even if it's a battle between two individuals who are really more concerned with defeating the other than with doing their assignment, which is to talk about the issues of the political conventions that occurred that day. That never happens. Yeah. That almost never happens in the debates. They talk about some of the candidates, which we found didn't translate to the present. You don't need to know about Hubert Humphrey today. So that there's none of that in there. So it's a pretty good ratio of content versus just high-minded, low-road ad hominem attack.
Okay. It's not just that event, their personalities, their rivalry that's the story. Equal story is how it turned around ABC and really changed political discourse in the media. I just want to give people a little quote before you comment on that. ABC at the time, there was this joke that if you wanted to end the Vietnam War, put it on ABC and it'll be cancelled in 3 weeks.
Yeah. They were the third of 3 networks. They would have been fourth, but there were only 3. And this turned out to be a really good thing for them because what the networks took away from this event was ratings went up for ABC as the quarrel got larger. There was 10 debates, and in the penultimate debate, kind of like as if a Hollywood script writer were plotting the narrative arc. There's an explosion in the 9th debate, and they have to come back and have a final meeting in which things are very different because they've been clearly chastened. But the networks took away that the ratings were going up, and we can see a shift that begins then toward the way we see TV today, political dialogue on TV today, which is all shouting, all talking points, no real exchange of ideas. One thing here is that while they're while they're attacking each other, they really are, they know they have this opportunity to address the nation. So they are trying to convey their ideas or convey what's wrong with the other person's ideas. Yep. It does ultimately devolve into a battle of lifestyles. You shouldn't be like that in front of the nation kind of thing. Yeah.
It's often a mistake I see people making in debates. They sometimes concentrate on trying to beat their opposition rather than win the audience.
Yes, exactly. You see that here, and the networks have taken away that people like a loud clash, and that's what we get. Today, instead of, where are the public intellectuals today? They're not public. They're in universities, they may publish books, but we're no longer a print culture. I sort of have this fantasy that there's going to be, in this mediascape where there's 1,000 channels, some network is going to be failing and say, before we go under, what can we try? What audience is not being served? What can we try? Perhaps someone will say, what if we give extended time to smart people to have a real exchange of ideas?
Everyone's run over to do the other thing. They've left that room empty.
Exactly. And maybe someone will be desperate enough to give that a shot and be surprised that they're getting more viewers, higher ratings than they get when they do the drivel that they've got on now.
Yeah. While I've got a real live American on the leash from New York, I really want to know, we look at Fox News. Most of us, I think, probably a bit like Jon Stewart does, but maybe even more aghast. Because, I don't know, what do you make of that sort of political discourse? Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity, it's different from this thing we saw with Best of Enemies, Gore Vidal and Buckley.
Yes, I think it's sort of like, well, you know what flash paper is? That paper that when you put a match to it, it has a big flame and burns out immediately and there's no ash.
Yeah.
I feel like that's what we have now. Instead of, whereas when Vidal and Buckley are going at it, it's a raging forest fire. Old wood is burning and the heat is intense. But in the things you're describing where it's really just agenda-driven talking points, And I feel like it's also a little bit like professional wrestling.
Yeah.
Where the success of a professional wrestling match is judged by how angry the audience gets. The audience is really there to shout, and scream. And so if they cheat behind the referee, it makes the audience angry, and that's good. And so I think that's what Fox News and these people you're describing are about. It's about angering the public and really forcing them into an agenda that may not even be to their best personal interest, but because they fear what the other side, what they've been led to believe the other side is, then they vote against their best intents.
Okay.
Their best.
Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley, they only died recently, 212, 28, I think, respectively.
Yes.
Did you get to speak with them personally or anything about this? Because this media event that they went through, it affected them for the rest of their lives.
It did. It hung with them forever. Buckley was dead. Vidal, we spoke to. He did not want to do anything that would lend any credence to Buckley. He walked in the room, or he was wheeled into the room. He was late in life, and he made a reference to having his rage to keep him warm. So we encountered a man on fire late in life who still hated this mortal enemy.
Yeah, it's a delicious rivalry. Hatred, actually, isn't it? It's delicious. And
it's enmity. It's a deep enmity, and people talk about it as delicious. You're not the first person to use that word, and I think it's because people are hungry. It shows a hunger for the kind of dialogue that you hear here.
Oh, fire in the belly. Good stuff.
Well, good, man.
Yep.
Turn out and enjoy it, people.
Yep.
Enemies.
You'll get to see one of the most compelling moments in the media. Robert Gordon, director, Best of Enemies, thanks very much.
Okay, thanks for having me on.
I do this so well and so terminally, I have left the bleeding corpse of William F. Buckley, Jr.